What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. And in this week's video, I'm going to go over the process of getting the wall tile installed in the bathroom in the not so tiny house. And considering these tiles were massive, large format tiles, and I ran them floor to ceiling on all 4 walls in the bathroom, this was a pretty huge undertaking. So I started this process in SketchUp, which is the 3D modeling software I use, so that I could plan out my tile layout. And my goal was to end the tiles at the ceiling with a full row of tiles, so I could work backwards from there to figure out where I needed to start my second row of tile from the floor, since the bottommost row would need to be ripped and scribed to fit the floor after the floor tile was installed later on. So once I figured out my starting height, I could get a line laser set up at that height and then go around just to confirm in real life that I'd end up with a full row at the ceiling, which was the case here. So next I got this string level system from Tools for Flooring mounted on the wall, and these plastic brackets supported the first row of tiles so that they didn't sag after they were set in place. And I really liked using this system and would definitely recommend it if you have a lot of wall tile to install. With that done, I could move on to getting the tiles for this first full row on the back wall prepped. And I first needed to figure out what length the 2 pieces on the ends needed to be cut to. And I used my laser measure here to figure out the width of the wall. And I really like using a laser measure when measuring a distance between 2 walls, since it can be a little bit tricky to get this measurement right with just a tape measure. Next, I could set one of the full tiles in place. And as you can see, these things are pretty massive at 14 inches by 39 inches. And then I could take some more measurements to determine the size of the 2 end pieces, making sure to account for the 1/16 inch grout joint between the tiles and a larger gap somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch where the tiles met up with the adjoining walls. Once I had that number figured out, I could move outside to get the end pieces cut to size. And if you watch the video on the floor tile, you'll notice that this was before I added that beast of a tile saw to my arsenal. And this little Craftsman B20 tile saw works great, but these massive 14 by 39 large format tiles were just really awkward to cut on a saw this size, hence why I ended up upgrading. I got the 2 end pieces cut and we dry fit the first row, and since the fit looked good, we could go ahead and get some thin set mixed up, and I ended up using this large format floor and wall tile mortar from Mapei here, and I think we ended up going through something like 5 50-pound bags of this stuff to install all of these wall tiles, so definitely be prepped for mixing up a lot of thin set on a project like this. I mixed the mortar according to the instructions on the bag, mixing it for 3 minutes, letting it rest for 5 minutes to slake, and then mixing it for another minute before getting it troweled onto the wall. And speaking of the trowel, I used this Euro notch trowel for this install, and this notch pattern is specifically designed for this kind of large format tile. And as you'll see, this pattern leaves a pretty thick layer of thin set on the surface after troweling, but the slightly angled notches help those ridges to collapse when setting the tile, making them easier to set and really embed in that thin set. You'll also notice that I made sure to trowel in one direction so that any air could escape from these notches rather than being trapped behind the tile, which would lead to voids in the thin set. Finally, before setting the tile, we back buttered or spread a thin layer of thin set on the back face of the tile, which just ensures good coverage and a super strong bond. Once that was done, I could set the first tile in place and made sure to really press it into place and kind of wiggle it back and forth to make sure it was set in the mortar bed. I repeated the same process for the 2 tiles along the edge of this wall, and you'll notice that I also used a tile leveling system here, which I would highly recommend when working with tiles this large. And so these white spacers slide under the back edge of the previous tile, and after setting the next tile in place, I could add these wedges with the included tool to make sure the faces of the tiles were aligned. And then I could move on to the second row, which was the exact same process as the first row. Once that row was set, we came to one of the trickiest parts of this whole tile install, the shower niche. So to mark where I needed to cut around this niche, I set the tile in place, making sure to install the spacers first, and then traced where the tile met the niche on the back face of the tile. Next, I transferred those marks to the front face of the tile with a speed square, and then I could get the notch cut. So I started by cross-cutting the 2 vertical cuts with the tile saw. I could finish the cut with my angle grinder with a diamond cutting wheel installed, and I was honestly pretty nervous about screwing up this cut since I didn't have a whole lot of extra of these tiles, but I just took my time first scoring a line in the surface of the tile before cutting to full depth, and it ended up turning out great. I cleaned up the inside corners, and then we could head back inside to get that row set in place. I repeated the same process on the next row, which ended up being even trickier since I had to notch the tile around both the niche and the window, and I did actually end up breaking one of these tiles in half when making this cut. I almost made a pretty major error on this second to last row, and rather than cutting 2 pieces for each side of the window, I cut 1 piece, which would have ruined the whole joint pattern I was going for, but thankfully I realized this before the thin set setup and yanked those tiles off the wall, but I decided to just move on to the adjoining wall since our thin set was really setting up at this point. So for the most part, this was just more of the same process, but I should mention that I ended up cutting this column of tiles down by an amount equal to the width of the tile on the adjoining wall, if that makes sense. Basically so it would look like these tiles wrapped around that corner. Also, you can see that these are actually 2 different tiles from the Florida Tile Amplify collection. And I decided to make the back wall the accent wall with this beautiful textured rise tile. And I used this smooth white tile for the rest of the walls. And I'll link to both of these tiles in the video description below in case you want to check them out. We ran out of the first batch of thin set at this point, so we called it a day, and day 1 was definitely a little bit stressful, but we really got into the groove of things on day 2. And we started day 2 by cleaning up all of the tile leveling wedges and removing any excess thin set from between the tiles. And these tile leveling spacers are designed to just break off, leaving the piece behind the tiles so you can remove the piece from the grout joints. And the wedges are reusable, so we cleaned off any excess thin set from those as well. And after removing all of the spacers, we came back with a grout saw to clean up any excess thin set from the joints. While Eddie worked on that, I added more sections of the string level system along the left wall since we'd be moving ahead with installation in that area next. And finally, after the joints were cleaned up, I came back with a white Scotch-Brite pad to remove any thin set on the surface of the tiles. And all of this cleanup work is a heck of a lot easier if you do it within 24 hours of installing the tile. Once all that was done, we got another batch of thin set mixed up and got to work installing the second to last row on the back wall first. And the top row ended up needing to be ripped ever so slightly to fit, so we held off on that until the big boy tile saw showed up so we could move on to the left wall next. Eventually we got to the tile where we needed to cut a hole for the shower mixing valve. I actually used a carbide hole saw to cut this hole since these tiles are ceramic, but I had a heck of a time getting the pilot bit started since it just wanted to walk around on the surface of the tile. I came up with a solution for this though, and I'll show that a little later in the video. Once the pilot bit was started, we moved outside to cut the hole with the hole saw, and I was honestly really surprised at how well this worked. And we wet the bit while cutting, and I just took it slow, and in no time I ended up with a super clean cut. So my hole saw ended up being the exact size of this mixing valve rough-in cover, so next was the real moment of truth, whether I got the location correct, and thankfully I pretty much nailed it, which was a big relief. Also, I should mention that we did add spacers where the 2 planes of tiles on the 2 walls met up so that I could apply some silicone caulk there later, and this spacing allows for seasonal movement, and we used 1/8 inch spacers here. While we're setting more tile, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, ShipStation. So if you have an online store and ship products, you'll know that shipping can be a huge headache. It's time consuming, it's expensive, and it usually requires managing multiple platforms with multiple passwords. It's just a total pain. And that's where ShipStation comes in. So their service funnels your orders into one simple interface that you can manage from anywhere, even from your cell phone. You can connect ShipStation to a ton of platforms, including Etsy, Shopify, Amazon, or how I've personally used ShipStation in the past with my Squarespace website. So once you import your orders into ShipStation, you can ship them with any carrier using ShipStation's deeply discounted rates, and you can easily compare carriers and choose the best solution for every order. ShipStation then generates labels, updates your store with tracking info for your customers, and then you can get things packed and shipped all with just a few clicks. So ship more in less time for a lot less money. Just go to shipstation.com/craftedworkshop to get a 60-day free trial. That's 2 months free of no hassle, stress-free shipping. That's shipstation.com/craftedworkshop. Make ship happen. Before too long, we used up our batch of thin set, so we called it a day there, and it was really exciting starting to see the tile come together. We could finish up the last row on the following day since finally the cavalry had arrived in the form of this beast of a DeWalt tile saw. And this thing was really a saving grace when it came to ripping these tiles, as there's just not a lot of other ways to get a perfect rip cut on a 41-inch long tile. Before getting to ripping, I did a quick test cut just to see how the saw performed, and needless to say, I was pretty impressed. When I say effortless, holy moly.
Yeah, what a beautiful machine.
That is insane. After geeking out on the new toy for a few minutes, we could get back to work and get the tile for the last row ripped to width, and we pretty much maxed out the ripping capacity on this saw making this cut. So we had to plunge the saw to start the cut, and once it was plunged and locked in place, I could just slide the carriage to make the rip, which went super smoothly. Next, I could temporarily fit the tile and mark where I needed to notch it around the window, but this time I could thankfully use the new saw to help with this cut. So as with the Craftsman saw, I made the cross cuts first, but the real ace up this DeWalt saw sleeve was the plunge functionality, which allowed me to start this rip cut in the middle of the tile. And all that was left to do after that was to tidy up the corners with the angle grinder, and then I could test fit the tile, which, as expected, fit just about perfectly. We got the last row installed and then moved along, wrapping up the tile on the leftmost wall, which was a breeze since we only had the shower head pipe to work around. We did leave that last tile off for the time being, since that would need to be notched around the door trim, which wasn't installed yet, and I just added a temporary piece of 3/4 inch material to allow us to install the rest of the tile. With that wall pretty much done, we could move on to the wall with the toilet and sink plumbing, and this wall-hung toilet was going to require quite a bit of material removal for all of the various connections. And rather than trying to drill the 6 holes needed for this, I decided to just notch an area large enough for all of these connections, since this area will be covered by the toilet and this white gasket anyway. I did use the gasket as kind of a template, which allowed me to figure out how large of a section I needed to remove, and once I had figured that out, I could head outside to cut out the section with the angle grinder. I test fit the piece after cutting it, and with that looking good, I went ahead and got the next piece dry fit as well, since it had all those sink connections. I did drill these holes, and to help keep the bit from wandering when starting the holes, I drilled a hole in a scrap 2x4 and used that to hold the bit steady while drilling the pilot hole. Once the pilot holes were drilled, we could get the larger holes drilled with more carbide hole saws from that same set, which once again worked great. With that done, we finished up most of the tile on that wall, and that's where we called it a day. The following day, I got the door hung and the PVC trim installed off camera, and I'll be doing an entire video on installing doors later on in this series, so stay tuned for that. Once that was done, I took a few measurements for the row of tile to the left of the door, and then we could get this last section of wall tile knocked out, which was really a breeze at this point. With that done, I switched gears to the floor tile, since most of the mess of the wall tile installation was behind us, and in case you missed last week's video on that process, I'll link to it in the cards and in the video description below. Once the floor tile was installed, I could get the last bits of wall tile prepped, including the pieces in the shower niche and window, and the bottom row. So I started by dry fitting all of these pieces, since they were all fairly tricky cuts, and I started with that bottom row and once again started with the back wall. So the center tile needed to be cut to match the slope of the shower pan, but thankfully this was pretty simple with some careful measuring and layout work. Once again, I made these cuts with the tile saw and just followed my lines, which obviously weren't square to the face of the tile, so I had to skew the tile accordingly. After cutting, I test fit the piece and it was looking good with a consistent 1/8 inch gap for the silicone caulk I'd be adding later. I filled in the 2 pieces along the edge, and then I could move on to the right wall. And the first piece on the right wall was a simple rip, but then I came to the piece that had to be notched around the curb, and this was a pretty tricky cut. Thankfully, I could first rip the piece to fit the wall outside the shower, and then I was able to mark the piece with it held in place rather than trying to take a bunch of measurements. And this kind of referential measuring works great for this kind of work, as I could also add spacers where needed rather than having to do a bunch of math. Once again, the plunge feature on the tile saw was majorly handy here, and I also tried tilting up the tile to clean up that inside corner, and this was also really helpful. Obviously, only do this if you're comfortable with it, but it definitely makes for a cleaner corner. I did still need to finish the cuts with the angle grinder, but this was really simple since the lines were already pre-cut most of the way through the tile. I could finally test fit the piece and just needed to shave a bit more off of the end in the shower before I got it fitting really nicely. I repeated the process for the rest of the bottom row, dry fitting and labeling the pieces, and then I could move on to the shower niche and window, which I had honestly been avoiding. So first I wanted to address some waterproofing, especially around the window. And I think it's probably pretty unlikely that you have a window in your shower, so this info might be unnecessary, but I spent way too much time trying to think through how to make sure this window wasn't destroyed by water. So I decided to first add a heavy layer of that waterproofing adhesive sealant to the extension jambs on the window, lapping it onto the edges of the Prova wallboard to really seal this area, and I also added more of the sealant in the same area in the shower niche for good measure. Once that dried, I added 4 coats of Total Boat Elixir to the unfinished wood on the window, and Total Boat Elixir is a water-based marine grade enamel paint that's designed for boats, so I figured it should work pretty well in a shower area. Next, I could get the Schluter Rondeck trim pieces fit in the window and niche, and these trim pieces will cover the cut edges of the tiles and give both areas a nice finished look. And Schluter makes corner connector pieces for this trim, but I personally think mitering these corners looks a lot better, so that's what I did here. I cut the pieces on my miter saw, and since these are made from aluminum, the miter saw cut the pieces super cleanly. And I made sure to really sneak up on my fit here, as I wanted a super tight fit on the miters. And this definitely took a little time since I had to cut each piece a few times to get it fitting perfectly. Eventually though, I got the pieces fit and they were looking great, so I could get the rest of the tile pieces fit as well. I started with the niche and decided to use the smooth tile on the edges and the textured tile on the back face to match the walls. And I started with the edge pieces since I wanted the back pieces to lap onto the bottom piece to keep water flowing away from the walls. And this was a great use for all the scraps I had accumulated during the tile install process. I used my snap cutter here since these cut edges would be completely covered, and I got the pieces dry fit off camera. Next, I could work on the tiles for the back of the niche, and I wanted the pattern on these pieces to match the wall tiles. So I had to do some layout work to make this happen, but thankfully I had some of the offcuts from when I cut these tiles around the niche, so I got these roughly fitting without too much trouble. Finally, I could get the pieces for the window fit, and these were some of the more tricky pieces since I had some of the molding on this window to contend with. Thankfully, this tile saw can also cut a bevel, so I was able to tilt the saw head and bevel the back edge of the tiles to meet up with the molding on the window. I also needed to notch the corners slightly again to clear the molding, and I did this with my angle grinder. Finally, I could fit the piece on the window, and as you can see, it fit pretty great. I repeated the process for the two sides and the top of the window, cutting the sides so the top piece would be supported by the side pieces during installation. And all in all, dry fitting the pieces for the bottom row, the window, and the shower niche was a multiple hour process. And once that was finally done, I could get the floor covered up with some ram board so I didn't get thin set all over it while installing these pieces. With that done, I could get my last bag of thin set mixed up, thankfully, and get to installing, starting with the window. I installed the bottom pieces first, adding the Schluter Rondeck and then the tile, and I made sure to angle the tile ever so slightly towards the shower so that water would run off the tile rather than pooling on the surface, and I verified this with my level. Next, I installed the left side pieces, and then I could get the top piece added. And once again, the top piece rested on the side pieces so that it wouldn't fall down while the thin set was setting up. After getting the top piece set in place, I got the right pieces set really quickly, hoping that the top piece wouldn't fall off, and thankfully it didn't. And I added wedges and spacers where needed just to keep everything in place while the thin set set up, and wiped off any excess thin set with a damp sponge before repeating the whole process on the shower niche. And the shower niche was a royal pain since I wanted to keep those grout lines aligned with the rest of the wall tiles, and this required a lot of adjusting and fitting, which just took forever, even with the pieces mostly pre-cut. I got the pieces fitting well eventually, and then I could move on to the bottom row, which was pretty simple compared to the window and the niche. The very last piece to install was this shower curb, which is a solid surface material designed for this kind of application. And it was easy to cut and fit, and I installed it with more thin set, once again angling it ever so slightly towards the shower so water would run off into the shower. With that, I could do a little cleanup work and finally call the tile setting complete in this bathroom, which was a huge relief. I wasn't quite done yet though, as I still needed to get everything grouted, and I once again went with this bagged grout, which I'm a big fan of after using it twice now on this bathroom project. I applied the grout from the top of the wall down, working my way around the room and then wiping off any excess from those top rows before moving lower on the walls. I did also manage to trip my breaker by shorting one of the wires by dripping water onto it, so turn off your power prior to grouting if you've got exposed wires like I do, but other than that, this process went really smoothly. I let the grout dry overnight and then needed to clean up some haze because, again, white grout on white tile made it really hard to see where there was grout left on the surface. And then once that was done, I could finally move on to caulking all of the places where the two planes of the tile met up. I used a color matched silicone sealant made by the same company as the grout, Mapei, so the color matched really well. And when applying this sealant, I made sure to really fill in that gap I had left between the two planes of the tile to help waterproof it, and then I could clean up any excess. Before doing that, I tried something new to me, using a window cleaner spray before tooling the sealant, and this spray keeps the silicone from sticking to your finger or your caulk tool. And this worked amazingly well, and I will definitely be using this tip anytime I use silicone caulk in the future. And I got all of the white silicone added on the walls before uncovering the floors, and then I could switch to a gray silicone that matched the grout on the floor. And I caulked the joints between the wall and the floor, the curb in the floor, and the underside of the curb sill and the curb tile. And once that was done, I could finally call the tile installation in this bathroom complete. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was obviously a huge project, but I'm personally really proud of how it turned out. I haven't done a lot of tile work in the past, and I really learned a lot doing this project. So next week's video is going to be on building the floating bathroom vanity for this bathroom, and then installing all of the rest of the stuff, including the wall hung toilet, the shower glass, all that stuff. So if you don't want to miss that video, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell. Also, as always, I'll have links to all of the tools and materials I use in this video down in the video description below. And last, I want to say a big shout out to all my YouTube members and my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. I'll have links to both of those programs here on the screen or in the video description below. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.